Main Opposition Samagi Jana Balawegaya welcomed the mini-budget, saying it contained several progressive measures, but questioned rollout of reforms given reservations by Sri Lanka Podujana Party. It is very progressive. We can't hide behind the fact that we are in the opposition and call it an absolute empty budget, SJB MP Dr. Harsha De Silva said at a post-budget media briefing held yesterday.
The amendments to the appropriation bill today, the President presented in his capacity as the Minister of Finance. In fact, it is progressive. We can't hide behind the fact that we are in the opposition and say it is an absolute empty budget, like my colleague Iran Vikramarth explained. Ideas are very positive. Things that need to be done have been mentioned as urgent measures, particularly on multitude of reforms that needs to happen. The question is whether the vote to opposition, or rather the vote to a government who's been opposed to all these amendments in the past, whether they would support these reforms to go through. So we will have to wait and see, because there hasn't been much discussion on how these proposals are to be implemented. Now, on the technical side of things, what we see is the revenue is only increasing minimally, while the expenditure is expanding in a huge way. You see, because not only due to the additional expenses in trying to deal with the difficulties faced by the low-income people, but also interest costs has gone up in leaps and bounds, because at the time when Basil Rajapaksa presented the first budget, or the 22's original budget, interest rates were something like 8%. Now interest rates are something like 30%. So there's been a massive increase in the interest cost. Even though we have suspended paying some of our debts, particularly the ISB and commercial debt owed to various foreign parties, the interest cost calculated in Sri Lanka rupees have actually gone up, even though we have suspended payment on interest. So that goes to show how significant the depreciation, etc. has been. So essentially, what we see is Ranil Wickremesinghe, the president, is attempting to change the course of this country's economic path. What he wants to do is to undertake serious reforms, A, to stabilize the economy, B, to restructure the economy into what we call a modern productive enterprise. So while he is doing that, or rather in order to do that, he has introduced a whole bunch of new laws to have a more disciplined system of governance. He has also introduced, for instance, Public Finance Management Act, which he proposes to bring in. So this is to bring in discipline in running the affairs of government. He is also proposing to bring in amendments to the Monetary Law Act, which is going to depoliticize the central bank from the treasury. And also he is suggesting to stop printing money. But he says in his budget speech that it cannot be done immediately, given the economic crisis we are in, but the objective is to do that. Then he is suggesting that we open up higher education for private investments, and also to bring in foreign universities and set branches of those universities in various parts of Sri Lanka. He is also proposing to sell off 20% of equity of People's Bank and of Bank of Ceylon to employees and depositors. Now, those things will have to be considered very carefully as to how they are going to be done. Yesterday, Nimal Siripala De Silva said that they are going to sell off parts of Sri Lankan catering and ground handling, whereas he didn't mention anything about the Sri Lankan Airlines per se. Now, the ground handling and catering are really profit-making enterprises, whereas the airline per se is making losses. So, what is the point in selling off the profit-making components, whereas nothing is said about the loss-making component? So, unless you package it in such a way that there is some incentive for persons to come in and buy the loss-making operation so that they get part of the profit-making operation, is something that can be considered, but not this way. So, what we are saying is, we don't disagree with the proposals in terms of reforms. We have always said we are pro-reform. Just because we are in the opposition, we are not going to oppose reform. You know, that would be cheap politics, and we are not here to do that. We are certainly considering the future of our nation, the next generation. That is our responsibility. So therefore, it is more of how the president is going to get his government group to support these things, which they have been opposing vociferously for the last several decades. I mean, every time we talked about reform, they opposed it. Every time we talked about, for instance, restructuring the Samurdhi program to one that is more equitable and where the exclusion and inclusion errors are minimized, what did they say? They opposed them. Right? Every time we talked about reforming the public sector, every time we talked about thinking about golden handshakes in state enterprises and so on, what did they do? They opposed it. So it is a quirk of circumstances, fate almost, that it is them who will have to now end up doing these reforms, right? So it is as if, you know, we have been saying no to this one girl all our life. Never will I even talk to you. Suddenly you have to get married to this girl. Right? So it is something like that. I think a good analogy is something like that. Last couple of points I want to make is about the Samurdhi and how the Samurdhi. So we are hoping that will happen when he proposes the 2023 budget in November. One last point is, however, while we do appreciate that he didn't have time to rehaul the entire inland revenue mechanism, we don't see any direct taxes being increased. Only that the indirect taxes are getting increased, which means it is regressive and the poor people are going to get hammered. We expected Ranil Wickremesinghe to walk his talk and to really take money from those people who we have been for the longest time accusing of dodging taxes, including certain members, I think, who are going to become ministers in his cabinet, right? Now, he hasn't done that, and we are disappointed with it because we expected him to do that, right? We have to be both positive and negative, you know, talk about the pros and cons of this whole exercise. So that is wanting, and he should have done that. He did say that every person over the age of 18 would then have to open a tax file immaterial of whether he or she would be paying taxes or not, which I think is very progressive. One other point that I want to mention, yes, he didn't really mention social benefit tax. I forget the exact name. Is being debated in the parliament this next 2-3 days, which is 2.5% turnover tax. In reality, 2.5% turnover tax is about 5% VAT. So VAT he increased from 12 to 15. He didn't mention the additional VAT-like tax of 5%. So in all reality, for all practical purposes, taxes from 1st of September partly and rest from 1st of October, the indirect tax that people will have to pay immediately will go up in another few weeks from 12% to 20%, right? Basil Rajapaksa brought it down to 8%, then it was increased to 12%, then today it was increased to 15%. By Friday, another 2.5% turnover, or in other words, approximately 5% in value-added tax will get added, so that will be 20%, right? So soon people are going to see the repercussions of these increases. So the point is that ideally, even for the next 4 months, the people who are going to be taxed should have been better targeted rather than the indirect tax that is going to be hammered on the middle class and the poor, and they are the people who are going to suffer the most. So there we see a big gap between rhetoric and what has been legally proposed today.
For more latest news, subscribe to FTTV.